All right, we are rolling, and we will keep rolling. Last but certainly not least is our final session of the main program here today, and we have a great panel discussion with people. That's why they're bringing out extra chairs here. And I think it really is a good culmination and builds on a lot of things we've been discussing, because it is all about exploring how we think about teaming, right, in GEOINT. And one of the things we've been talking about is this tremendous improvement in the capabilities we have, this tremendous improvement in the capability to collect, to analyze, to process geospatial intelligence information. It's also becoming not the sole area of deep experts within the field. And a lot of times we have this discussion on what opportunities, what challenges does that prevent? The fact that the technology is just becoming pervasive, right? And we have a great panel here set up for you today that can help us discuss, understand, and discuss some of those challenges and those opportunities. These are no strangers to you. The first one was here, very visible yesterday. And if you don't know this name, you must have been sleeping through like everything here, because it is Robert Cardillo, who is the chair of the USGIF Board of Directors and was yesterday's MC on stage. He will be joined by Ed Bornstein, who I've known for quite a few years in all kinds of different capacities. But right now, and fairly recently, he is currently serving as the Associate Deputy Chief of Space Operations for Intelligence with U.S. Space Force. And they will be joined as panel members by Greg Reichman, who is the Deputy Director for Global Integration at DIA. And we have a really special moderator here with us this morning. It is Honorable Kari Bingen. She is currently the Senior Fellow with the International Security Program at CSIS, or the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's also an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University, serves on a number of corporate and nonprofit advisory boards. But prior to her current role, with industry, with academia, she was the chief strategy officer of a space technology company for Hawkeye 360, because I was with her last night, and a lot of people know her from that role. But her previous roles in public service included Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, and also Policy Director for the House Armed Services Committee. And when she was the Deputy Undersecretary, I owe her quite a bit, because she sat on the panel that interviewed and selected me to be the 7th Director of NGA. So I have a special place in my heart for Kari Bingen. Please help me welcome our moderator, Kari Bingen, and her spectacular panel members. It's so good to see you. Thank you so much. All right. Great to see you.
Well, Admiral Sharp, you did pass the test. We needed you, and we're very glad that you continued to serve as Director of NGA. So, Kari Bingen, I am really privileged to speak this morning with these esteemed gentlemen to my left. Admiral Sharp did the introductions. I'll just emphasize I've had the good fortune of working with each of these three gentlemen through the course of my career, whether when I was on the Hill or in the Pentagon or out in the outside world now. So, Robert Cardillo, former Director of NGA, used to brief the president every morning with the President's Daily Brief. His tenure at DIA, first civilian to be the Joint Staff Director of Intelligence. We've got Ed Bornstein here as well, Associate Deputy Chief of Space Operations for Intelligence, former NGA Chief of Staff, but then also has service time as well, so Army Futures Command, and I look forward to talking to you about that. And then here, Greg Reichman at DA now, Deputy Director for Global Integration, but also brings important, I'll say, that warfighter perspective. So CENTCOM, Deputy Director for Intelligence, and also several deployments to Afghanistan. So he's really seen firsthand intelligence used on the battlefield. So this is GEOINT as a team sport panel. Senior leaders here in the field who've seen these issues from a variety of different perspectives. NGA, agencies, military services, combatant commands, and then now the private sector with Robert. So in emphasizing this team sports theme, we're going to talk GEOINT, within NGA, beyond NGA, with NGA, technology trends and their implications for the GEOINT mission and how it operates, as well as the dynamics and relationships across the ecosystem. This will be candid. Maybe we'll try to be a little provocative here this morning, but I think also these gentlemen will be able to frame and contextualize many of the issues that have been discussed thus far, and then the panels to come later in the conference. So just as a reminder, please go ahead and submit your questions via the app, and we'll get to as many as we can. So I want to start with Robert here. I'm going to ask you the hindsight Monday morning quarterback question. Knowing what you know now, what did you get right and maybe not right while you were director at NGA? And what did you leave on the field?
So I think as fast as I thought I was moving, I didn't move fast enough. And I suspect I'll have some teammates at NGA who says, no, you move plenty fast. But I guess what I mean by that is, now, especially that I have 5 years outside the government, I have a fuller appreciation for how fast this industry team moves. I mean, quarter by quarter, month by month. And my teammates in government will know that's difficult pace for the government to keep up with. And so I guess I wish I had found a few more avenues to introduce capabilities, test, evaluate, deal with the proverbial valley between that and program, which continues to exist. And I think the other thing that I wish I had done better was communicate to my team about the value of what I felt strongly was available. And I think, unfortunately, I miscommunicated and made it somewhat of a competition. This is better than that, and this can replace this, and I guess I should have been more of a communicating the team sport nature of it. And as I said in my opening comments yesterday morning, that the machine side, the tech side, is really good at some things and not good at the really hard things, the human analytic-driven pieces. And I guess I wish I'd communicated that partnership better.
Well, and we'll be able to dive into a couple of those different areas. I also want to hit on the topic of GEOINT democratization and what GEOINT means to each of your organizations. One trend that we're seeing is just this democratization and distribution of GEOINT capabilities. Not just NGA, but the services, the commands, the private sector, they all have access to GEOINT technology and capabilities. What's driving this more broadly across the national security community and within your organizations? And Greg, maybe I'll start with you. You've got the agency view now, Defense Intelligence Agency. Thinking about DAA's support to combat commands, your foundational military intelligence mission, what does GEOINT look like from a DIA perspective?
Yeah, and thanks for that question, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. There's probably no more critical int in terms of our foundational military intelligence mission than GEOINT, and therefore there's probably no closer partner that DIA has than NGA. So this is absolutely critical to us. What's fascinating to me, DIA's primary kind of, if you really boil it down, is our job is to create a proxy for reality that commanders and decision makers can plan and make decisions off of. Historically, that was a fairly static picture, right? It was, units in garrison, it was infrastructure, and now we have the tools and capability to go dynamic and actually do the same thing that we used to do in a static sense in a much more dynamic way. You mentioned time at CENTCOM and downrange. I spent a lot of years where we did, we kind of looked at deliberate targeting and dynamic targeting almost as two fundamentally different things because of our capabilities weren't there to do the same thing on deliberate as we did on dynamic. And I know that deliberate sounds slow. That's not the point. The point is we have the ability now to do more informed and more intelligence fused to be able to do dynamic targeting more accurately than what we used to do, which was, quite frankly, single int that we put our best assessment on top of. That's changed now. And so we have the ability, we've heard this morning, I think yesterday as well, we have the ability to do this faster and on scale. One thing we have to think through, though, is it's about objects, right? If we're going to hold a target at risk, we're holding an object at risk. And we need to have an end-to-end understanding of that object, and how do you manage it? Because that object that's static, when it goes dynamic, all the attributes of that object need to go with it. And we need to be able to understand that as it's dynamic and moving around. And when it goes back to being static again, everything it did when it was dynamic needs to inform what it is when it's static. So as I think about where DIA is at in terms of Mars and our object management system, is how can we then now get to a point with the new technologies we have to provide that same foundational military intelligence fidelity of dynamic objects and be able to provide that service for the decision maker and warfighter.
Then Ed, you're now here in the Space Force capacity, new military service, evolving thinking on space as a warfighting domain, expanding threats. You're looking up, not looking down. So what does GEOINT look like for the Space Force?
Thanks, Kari. And I'll echo what Greg said. It's great to be here back with my GEOINT teammates, and great to be part of this panel. I think all good discussions of this type start with understanding the threat. It's paragraph 1A. So I'll talk a little bit about how we see the threats from space. And I'll start with the bottom line up front, and that is that and in terms of the threat, I'll talk about the PLA and Russia almost entirely, and much of that about the People's Liberation Army. The PLA is actively developing and expanding capabilities to challenge our strategic stability and attack our critical assets in space. And they're doing that in order to defeat our ability to project military power. This is largely done under the heading of A2AD. The PLA declared space as a warfighting domain and established the Strategic Support Force in 2015, so not that long ago. The pace of CCP advancement, particularly in space, is staggering. Since 2015, the PLA has increased their space capability, as measured by the number of satellites on orbits, by 550%. Most of this is ISR capability. They know how our forces operate, and they are building space-based ISR capability in order to be able to detect and track our power projection. Just to put a finer point on this, in the last 2 years, the PLA has put 450 satellites on orbit. So preserving the US freedom of action in this increasingly contested space requires a military force, an armed force specifically organized, trained, and equipped for the purpose. That's the US Space Force. The Space Force was established to contest and, when directed, control the space domain on behalf of the Joint Force. One of the things that we're working on is continuing to overcome the unconscious bias or the assumption in military planning that we will have space superiority. I think this is the key point. It's far more likely that we will have to fight for, gain, and maintain access to space and the ability to use space to our advantage. Understanding this threat is the work of the Space Force, our IC partners, our commercial partners, our international partners, academia are all part of understanding what the threat is. As you would expect, most or a good part of the work about understanding the threat is done in a classified environment. But there's an awful lot that's available in the unclassified world. The Space Force publishes quarterly a space threat fact sheet cleared for public release. Kari, you and your team recently produced their 2024 threat assessment from CSIS. DIA has done challenges in space, challenges to security in space for the past several years. And there's unclassified newsletters. The National Space Intelligence Center and the National Air Intelligence Center produce an unclassified product called Competing in Space. So For this audience, I think understanding how grave and rapidly advancing the threat is, I think it would be really good to avail yourselves of some of those.
Well, thank you for plugging the CSIS non-classified space threat assessment, so I don't have to. But I did bring some hard copies, so happy to share those with anyone after. It's a really great piece of work. Robert, I'm going to start integrating audience questions, because these are really good. Some of these are better than mine. So I want to broaden the definition of GEOINT. When I think about some of these commercial technology trends that we're seeing on display here at the conference, you and I both have experience working with Hawkeye 360 that does radio frequency RF GEOINT, as do some other companies as well. I think about the generative artificial intelligence trends, where there are no longer domain-specific, or you have domain-specific models, but you're branching it out now to these large language models that cut across domains. So do we need to broaden our thinking on what constitutes GEOINT? And maybe even more provocatively, are we seeing these INTs merge together? Is there still a unique GEOINT mission and analytic tradecraft that needs to be preserved? And then I'll even throw in an audience question here. How do you see cross-INT teaming evolving, for example, between OSINT and GEOINT?
Look, I think those are exactly the right questions, and whether Ed describing the reality of the threat and how that's rising, and Greg, how DIA is rethinking how it provides that foundational intelligence. Look, I'm in the former seat, so I can easily say that the lanes, even between your two organizations, are dual-edged. They obviously help. Ed's team focuses on the training, doctrine, support capability that we need from the Space Force, and DIA has a broad mandate to provide the foundation underneath it. And look, I grew up in DIA, right? I mean, it's my home room, essentially, as a professional. And I'm well aware that those lanes get in the way. There are barriers, and I worry sometimes that the way that we've delineated the boxes on the chart, I'm not advising that we smash all the boxes together, although that would be fun. I worry that the threat's outpacing the boxes. And I worry that, and by the way, if there's lawyers in the room with love, I say that, we have to have, right, legal, moral, and ethical policies. But I also worry that those processes are going to inhibit the speed. And so what am I trying to say? I absolutely think we need to broaden the definitions. I do look to places like DIA to be centralizing, and I know that can scare some people about that, because my lane, your lane, my authority, your authority. But as proud as I am of NGA's contributions, and as important as NGA's contributions are to the framework, as you described, for context so that we can chat, we really have to have a unifying effort. And maybe it's the objects, Greg, that you brought up. We can all agree those are the important objects. And I guess one of my worries is, and this isn't industry's problem to own, but unfortunately sometimes different tools end up at different agencies for good reasons, right? Contracts, authorities, et cetera. But then it splits up the objects, right? Oh no, I'm over here on this system, tracking in this interface and whatnot. So rather pessimistic answer, Kari. I do worry about the lanes getting in the way. I do think, and I guess because the threat is so real, I think we make real change when crises occur. I just worry that this crisis will be bigger than ones we've experienced before, and will we have enough time to react?
Yeah. Well, and something else that's just been stunning to me to see is really the pace of the technology development in the private sector that, frankly, I just don't think DoD and the intelligence community, they cannot replicate, I'll say, just private sector AI and compute at the scale or speed or investment that the private sector is doing. Just to give one example, global AI investments are estimated to approach $200 billion by 2025. U.S. government investment, less than $5 billion. Just think about that contrast. I had one tech leader tell me There is 100 times more investment in compute by big tech than currently in GovCloud. This is just staggering in terms of scope. So maybe Greg, I'll start with you, but talk through what you're seeing. I mean, is this tech revolution, is it appreciated within your organization? How is it changing what you're doing? And then how do you see these trends affecting the relationship between government and industry?
No, I think this is really the challenge. And to kind of start by building off of Robert's comment is, when you're in a crisis, that's the worst possible time to have objects have an identity crisis. If a commander's trying to make a decision and we're giving them several different objects that have different attributes to make a decision off of, having done this enough, that will result in either no decision or a bad decision. So we have to get to a point where we don't have object identity crisis as we're going through this process. And the part about GeoINT being a team sport and the IC being a team sport is, if you have a football team with 11 Tom Brady's on offense, it'll be a really bad football team, right? So we do have to find a way that we optimize each other's strengths and that we play to our strengths so that we don't dilute our strengths in a way that the collective good suffers, right? So there are certain things that we're best at and that we're good at, depending on where you sit in the IC. And sometimes I worry a little bit that we're trying to get into where everybody answers the entire question all alone, as opposed to trying to look at it as a collective solution to a problem. So I think in this big data piece, part of the challenge is this next fight, I think, will be defined by who gets their arms around data, is able to understand it, and use it to basically either defend themselves or use it from an offensive context. And then about C2. Can you understand that data? We heard this morning about sensing and then sense making. Whoever can get to that sense making the fastest and then communicate that to decision makers so they can make decisions in potentially a disconnected environment or a stressed environment is going to probably win this fight. It's just the reality. And oh, by the way, in the competition sense, in some domains of the warfighting domains, we're actually beyond competition. We're in conflict. We are actually engaged with the adversary, certainly in different domains. And so we have to think that way now. It's not a problem for the future. It's a problem for today. And as I kind of think through this, we're trying to bring in data literate folks. We're trying to build things like Mars and the object management system to be able to do this. We're developing things like Redline, which is able to autonomously produce intelligence reports based on having gone through pretty rigorous ATO process. We have to be in that space. But I do worry that the proliferation of solutions to our data problem have become their own problem. And the proliferation of solutions to the data problem is where we sometimes get multiple objects because we have different tools being applied, and those tools aren't interoperable, and those tools don't come back to informing so we can get a common solution to the issue. That's my biggest worry. Whoever gets this right in the next fight is going to have a massive advantage. Whoever gets it wrong is going to have the disadvantage. And we should ask ourselves collectively every day, everybody in this conversation, are we best postured? Are we better postured than our adversary on this question? And I don't know that we are. And that should keep us awake and focus us for the future.
Ed, thoughts?
So space and space operations are inherently a really high-tech endeavor. I agree with everything that Greg just said, mostly that figuring this out in extremis or when fight's on is way too late. The integration and the ability to use data to make decisions, we need to experiment with that now as a joint force. And then once we've experimented to prove or disprove hypotheses about how we may fight, we need to train with it extensively and earnestly as a joint force in order to be ready. In terms for the Space Force, one of the central aspects to data management is the UDL, the Unified Data Library. When almost everything that we do in the Space Force will reside in that data lake. When we interact with industry, among the first things that we talk about is, are you aware of the UDL, and is your data compatible with and part of the UDL ecosystem? Almost always the answer is affirmative. the industry knows about it, they embrace it, and that's a good thing. And that's where we will advance our data management, our use of AI and ML, and I don't think it's an absolutely perfect tool, but it's pretty darn good, and it's what we're using now, and we're getting good results from it.
And then Robert.
Ed,
yeah.
you were just in the Army. Well, you've been in the Army a couple of times, but you were recently in the Army again, Futures. So did you ask that question from Futures Command about the UDL?
Did not, because I didn't know there was a UDL until 100 days ago when I joined the Space Force. But the Army is working on I just talked about it yesterday, a geospatial intelligence data fabric that AGC is working on, and I think it
UDL
might be
like?
different purpose, but similar capability.
I mean, again, not picking on Ed or the Army. My worry is that which data library are you talking about? You know, and again, I think everyone does it with the right intent. Right? I worry if it's going to come together.
Well, and then Robert, a question from our participants here. You've seen multiple sides of this now. What are you doing, being out of government now, to influence or help our current leaders in the government move faster with integrating and acquiring these capabilities? You know, how do you see that demand signal generation?
Frankly, again, I'm going to go a little dark, a little pessimistic. I worry that the broad budgeting programming machine that we still have today is the one that we built in the 60s to compete with a big machine, the Soviet Union. And kudos to Secretary McNamara and the whiz kids and all that who came up with a way to out-machine that machine. But I'm pretty sure we won that like in 1990, right? 89. And yet, we kept the machine. And this adversary, Ed has rightfully described, isn't playing those rules. So to the extent that, and look, former secretary, we just had a commission to look at the PPBE, you know, and look, very high-powered people took a look at it. You know, went to the Hill, went to industry, and I think we're all making the right observation. The machine needs to be re-engineered, rebuilt. What my worry is that there's so much investment in that current machine, or the legacy, that there's too many powerful forces, some on the Hill, some in this room, that won't enable us to do it. And again, then I go back to, we'll probably do it after the crisis happens.
Yeah.
Again, I just worry it's too late. So I'm trying to send that message, Kari, mostly on the Hill, because you know, they control a lot of those levers, as you well know. But even in the best of times, whenever you want to decide that was when, or when that was, the Hill's a difficult thing to create, especially such a sea change. I'll finish with saying, though, I do think the DIUs of the world are effective and efficient. I give the Deputy Secretary credit for the Radar initiative. So we're doing the best I think we can to fill the gap between today and the program. I think it just needs to be amplified and accelerated.
Well, and I want to pick up on this earlier discussion you just had on integration, and you know, challenge a little bit of, I'll say this, the status quo with respect to architecture and processes. I mean, we're seeing this trend afoot here on proliferation and more networked architectures. You have JADC2 as a concept within DoD, connecting an array of different sensors and shooters across services, domains, et cetera. Task and collection, let's talk about that, is when you have hundreds of satellites up there, it becomes less about, those just become nodes, and it's really much more focused on that integration, that network architecture, you know, tasking, collection management. You no longer have a few things that you have to control tasking on. So how do you think about, I'll say, tasking and collection management as we shift to these more networked, enterprise, proliferated architectures? And maybe any of you want to take that.
I can go first. I mean, I think with every great opportunity comes challenge, right? So we have an opportunity now to provide a level of intelligence support to commanders and decision makers we've never had, which is awesome. We talked earlier this morning, or it was discussed about access to denied areas. What I think I try to keep in mind from a DIA perspective is when commanders do their war plans and their campaign plans, historically they've been able to, because they control amount of ISR, be able to determine where it would be applied, when it would be applied, and they could do a soak or commit it, overcommit it, whatever. It was within their control to make sure they had that available for that kind of coverage. I think we have to be able to figure out how we're going to be able to meet those same requirements with the space-based architecture that we're talking about, to be able to still allow them to have confidence as they execute or put a plan together and they're going to execute it, that they're going to have what they need, when they need it, where they need it, to be able to answer the questions they have to have answered, to be able to prosecute that flight. That's got to be a very key part of this. And then I think we don't talk enough about the PED of this process, right? So part of it is tasking what we collect, but we also have to get that information. We have to be able to aggregate it in some way, process it, and get it distributed out to the people who need it. And we have to be able to do that at speed and scale, and we have to do that at the edge, and then we have to be able to do that resiliently, potentially in a disconnected environment, because we have adversaries now who can actually challenge our ability to not only collect the information, but to move the data. So it's a much harder problem, but the opportunity in that is so amazing that I'm way more on the optimistic side than the concern side, because I think we can figure our way through it. It's just, we've got to remember that the guys who are fighting the war on the ground have a need to have some certainty they're going to get what they need, when they need it, where they need it to prosecute that fight.
Now, Robert, you've got thoughts on this.
So about the time this symposium was being ideated, 2003, I was the Central Imagery Tasking Officer, or the director of the Central Imagery Tasking Office, which is what it sounds like, central tasking. And I, for the community, managed the allocation of our national technical means. And while I still can't tell you the numbers today, remember in 2003, we were on the cusp of operations in Iraq. We were supporting Hans Blix from the United Nations, who was leading an international search for the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We had Dr. Rice and Vice President Cheney and President Bush, who were putting together the case for war, and we had General Franks down in Central Command getting ready for the order. I can tell you, I was not adjudicating across those three demand signals for the few tasking operations that I had was very difficult. So it was very important then to be very careful about it. And I say that just to make your point, Kari, which we've got a great expanse in our sensing today. Mm-hmm. And I agree with you that, and by the way, I like Admiral Whitworth's phrase, collection orchestration, because I do think that is still needed. And by the way, I do think it should include the ground, Greg. I mean, don't just tell me about what's going to get picked, an image or sense. How are we going to get to the insight or the answer, right? Now, that, to my mind, doesn't happen as much as it should today. Meaning, I think, yes, we still kind of think about the front end, we get that set, and then goes to the back end. I think there's hope, though, there, right? I think if we can put it on the how do we make sense out of all that sensing, that orchestration across the boxes, I think gives us hope that we can overcome the inhibitors.
My analogy is Uber. It should be as easy to task or get collection from a satellite as it is to hail an Uber car when you have such a greater supply than maybe you do currently.
So Kari, if I could,
Yeah.
so on tasking and collection management, I think it's important to keep the end in mind. What are we really trying to achieve? Context is everything. And speed on the future battlefield is going to be, I think, the primary consideration. in my recent 4-year enlistment in the Army, I spent a lot of time providing intelligence support to the team that is figuring out the future warfighting concept. And they believe that that concept revolves around greatly reduced sensor-to-shooter timelines and the speed of decision-making and everything that will generate rapid pace and tempo on the battlefield. The tasking process has to be consistent and supportive of that. We heard General Miller talk about it yesterday, but keeping the end in mind and trying to figure out what we're really trying to achieve, I think is an important part of any cycle or any process that we design for future warfighting.
So given that need for speed, automation, onboard processing, advanced analytics, where does that leave GEOINT analysis and the tradecraft, and what is that balance between the human and the machine?
Frankly, I think we heard it yesterday morning. You know, General Miller stood up here and gave a very strong, I need it now. Whatever it is, the pixel, the signal, whatever. And by the way, I need it directly into the ops center. Now, he was, I think, fine with it going to the Intel center too, but boy, don't make me wait for it. He said a few times, don't make me wait for it. And then we had Admiral Whitworth stand up and say, look, yes, and context, assessment, right? Which I appreciate the operator will hear delay. And the Intel person will say, no, insight, advantage. So these aren't mutually exclusive, but there is a greater and greater tension. And let's face it, even with the advent of commercial capability, the operator is going to be getting more and more real-time inputs. To me, as a former intelligence senior executive, I think the Intel community needs to figure out, one, how we, too, say thank you to that real-time info, but find a way to show the value by, adding the sense-making and adding further assessment. Shoot, even verification. We haven't yet talked about disinformation, right, or fakes, right? By the way, you can get that very quick, too. So, again, I think it's like anything else, it's a hybrid.
Well, and heck, you've briefed presidents. Will the president make a decision based on machine-generated analysis? Will a general officer, will a combatant commander execute a COA built by a machine? I mean, how do we think about that, when it comes down to the actual decision-making? And then how do we think about trust and risk, to some of the points you were just making, Robert?
Yeah, I think they have to. I know it's uncomfortable. I worry about the phrase human in the loop. And I worry about it this way, that and by the way, I know people who believe strongly human in the loop, but by the way, my construct is human on the loop, meaning, yes, design the process, tune the algorithm, do the testing and evaluation, run the error codes and whatnot, but then let it run. And by the way, I'm good with it running right to a decision that the human has decided. If this threshold of information is reached, this weapon is released. I mean, I get it, and that has big implications, but I fear if we don't find a way to do that, we're going to lose, because I don't believe the adversary will inhibit themselves with a lot of checks.
So I think it's not a binary question. It's not an either-or question. I think it's both, right? So the ultimate decision maker as to whether or not to take the risk on the information provided them to make a decision is that commander or whoever's been delegated that authority. And so I think we have to get them information as quickly as we can, at the same time that we run that information through the processes that we've been running. We heard this morning, don't throw away the past necessarily going forward, right? So I don't think it's binary. I think we can do both. Rules of engagement and targeting engagement authorities are a thing that those commanders are very comfortable doing. But imagine, again, to my comment earlier, if that sensor goes straight into that ops room and there's an imagery sensor and there's a SIGINT sensor and they both have two different objects doing something different, the first thing they're going to do is grab the two and say, what's going on? If the two hasn't had that information go through some process to add the context Robert talked about, they're not going to be able to answer that question. And then we're going to have decision paralysis because we've just given that decision maker conflicting information. So we have to be able to do both, and we have to be fast to get it there, and then they can make the decision on whether to execute off of that based on giving them the provenance of the data. But then we also have to do what we know how to do, because we've done it forever, is to provide a all-source informed answer to the question that can then weed out. If there's a fake in there, several different ints will smoke that out really, really fast. And we have to be ready to get tricked by, whether in the EW space, where the adversary is going to be able to inject uncertainty into the conversation. The only way to fix that is to give an all-source or a much more fused answer to that question.
Okay. Let me throw out one more question here. I want to talk about workforce development and workforce of the future, but also want you to use the opportunity to hit on anything that we haven't hit on yet that you want to make sure you emphasize. Foundational GEOINT skills like imagery analysis have traditionally required extensive training. So how do we simplify and tailor that for users maybe outside the GEOINT community or users of GEOINT? But then also, I think about my kids who are using MetaQuest every day, augmented reality, virtual reality. With the workforce coming in now, they're already immersed in this digital environment, and they learn differently. So how do we meet them where they are in terms of GEOINT training and professional development? So workforce development, and then maybe some last thoughts. Ed, you want to jump?
I think one of the most interesting and perhaps far-ranging initiatives in the Space Force today is what we're going to do with officer training. OTC, the officer training course. In a nutshell, previously new lieutenants coming into the force selected their specialty or their branch before they came in. Before I was one of them, really knew what the work was about and what the branches or specialties did. And that was a big bet. Choosing infantry was something that I was going to be for the entirety of my career. Space Force is now going to bring all of its accessions into a single unified training program and put them through space operations, cyber, and intelligence training in 4-month cycles, so a 1-year training program before any of those officers, those lieutenants, are assigned what their career field is going to be for the rest of their career. Now, there's an acquisition and engineering part of that as well, but that won't be part of the initial training. But in terms of workforce development and talent management, it's one of General Saltzman's initiatives. It's going to start in September of this year, and I think it might be one of the most important and revolutionary things that we do. Everybody will have a baseline in the 3 fundamental skill sets that comprise the Space Force: space operations, cyber, and intelligence. I think it's going to be great. It's a heavy lift to get it off the ground, but I think it's a really important initiative.
I think I'll go be quick. One of our big challenges, we're not having a hard time recruiting data literate folks into DIA. It's keeping them motivated, because what we're not doing is we're not providing them a data literate or a data informed environment to work in, right? So we're recruiting them, they understand the challenge, but when they get into the system, are we providing them an environment that continues to stimulate them and leverage that capability? We owe that to them, and I don't know that we're doing as good as we can. Closing comment I would make is what underpins all of this is, our pacing challenge is the PLA and Xi Jinping. And people used to ask me what kept me up at night, and it was nuclear weapons getting in the hands of terrorists and things like that. What keeps me up at night now is it's not just in the security apparatus, but more broadly, folks not realizing the competition/crisis that we are in today. Xi Jinping's goal by 2049 is to change the world fundamentally. 2049 is 25 years from now. I'm hoping to be alive. For those early on in their careers, whether you're in the government or out of the government, this will dominate your career, just like counterterrorism dominated mine. I don't know that resonates with folks, but this whole conversation we're having is underpinned by the threat from that adversary that we are facing. And I think, we could go into a longer soliloquy on this, but please my call to action is, when you get up every day, ask yourself, are you doing what you can to try to change that paradigm so that 2049 doesn't become a reality, or at least the reality Xi Jinping wants it to be?
Robert, last thoughts.
What gives me hope is that we've got these two leaders still in the fight and pushing forward with their experience, but in a way that welcomes that talent that wants to come serve. So I'm optimistic.
All right. Well, everyone, let's join me in thanking these panelists and appreciate all your thoughts.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Kari, Greg, Ed, Robert. That was a great way to wrap up, and I just want to double tap on some of what they're saying here. That teaming and the emphasis on teaming is really important. And I think some valuable discussion on with the democratization of GEOINT. Do we have other people that start to do this? And we've had this debate in the Navy forever, like, do we need specialists or do we need generalists? And the answer we always come down to is we need both, right? So I think there is room for growth, and I'm more than a little biased, but I think that everybody benefits by having at least some level of geospatial perspective, geospatial understanding as we're solving complex problems. I love the discussion on the fact that the discussions yesterday between the general and the admiral weren't mutually exclusive, right? The right answer is we need to do all of that together, and I think that we will be more successful when we do so as a team, right? And we create diverse teams with diverse perspective to figure out how we leverage technology, leverage our partnerships to be more successful in the future. And then I love the fact that although Robert Cardillo was pessimistic several times, admittedly so, at the very end he was optimistic based off of his trust and confidence in the people that are doing this job to get it done, right? That no matter how daunting the challenges we're facing, we have the wherewithal to do what our nations need us to do because of the people we have and the strength of our partnerships. I want to thank you all for being here this morning. After we break for lunch, I think you'll find a banquet of options available for you this afternoon. The exhibits remain open until 5 o'clock p.m., and there's something for everyone among the various sessions, right? I challenge you to network with fellow leaders in the GEOINT field. I challenge you to meet people that you don't know, right? I threw out a challenge of 1, now I give you a challenge of 3. Stay connected, right? Meet new people. Visit one, at least, of the exhibit booths. I challenge you, at the high end, you can visit all 245. That would be pretty challenging, but some people are probably up to that challenge. Some great panel discussions with the government, the Vista Hub, some great quick insights with the 28 lightning talks available at the Innovation Hub. We're still holding training sessions that are available. There's still engagement opportunities with the working groups. You can find the times and locations with all the details on that in your GEOINT app, right? So as we break from here, I want to once again remind you what makes our community so special, right? What makes our community so special is this. It is our shipmates, it's our friends, it's our family. We are family, which brings us to our walk-off song. Please enjoy this as you're going to lunch, as you're going to new events. And Miss Jen, if you could crank up some Sister Sledge for us all, we would greatly appreciate it. Have a great afternoon, everyone.